Welcome to another episode of Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders for coders about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer, author, and software architect.
And I'm Beej, the journeyman developer sharing my journey in development.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
Pair programming is extremely efficient in certain circumstances, both for improving code quality and for cross-training developers. However, it can be hard to sell the idea to management and to other developers. It can also be hard to get it right, especially if you haven't done it often. In this episode, we're going to discuss the basics of pair programming. We'll talk about how to organize pair programming sessions, deal with problems, and how to sell the idea to management, which is often the hardest part. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
Not much of anything. We've got, Good Friday coming up, and so it's a 4-day week, and there's kind of a mad scramble to make sure things are stable, because that's a time when a lot of money comes in. It's right around Easter. But that said, we're not doing a lot of stuff that destabilizes things either. And so it's been relatively painless. There's been honestly a bit more waiting around than I would prefer, but I'm getting a lot of Pluralsight stuff in. I've gone through like a 9-hour Angular course. I'm going to go through one on database indexing now. Like, just things are pretty good. Yeah, there's nothing too special going on. How about you?
Well, we are at the end of a sprint. And so, yeah, we got a lot going on. I've been fighting for acceptance criteria. Basically, different stories for the UI and the API, because the API is an internal service, but there's one part that has a little bit of a UI. And so all the API stories have been their own thing. And then we get to this and we're building it very differently. Basically, I had to do about a week's worth of work in a couple of days to get what they needed to not fail the sprint, because they built all their stuff, but then they were basically told, expect this from the API in their stories. And we were told, provide something different in our stories.
That's no fun.
Yeah. And some of it was they were told, pass this in and expect this back. And we didn't have any of that. Like, it just wasn't in our stuff at all. And it just got assumed. What happened was the BA who wrote the stuff has a good understanding of things from a UI perspective, but it has struggled with getting things down from hey, there's no UI to this piece, and just didn't know, hey, I need to tell them they need to have this in there. So I ran into an issue during this unboxing an array. Well, actually, it wasn't so much unboxing the array. I could get the array out of the object. It was seeing if the object had an array in it, because the get type method in C# returned it as a JSON element. Now, I finally figured out that system.text.json.json element, to get all .netty on y'all, has an enum property called value kind.
Yep.
For each of the types. And I could determine if it was an array by comparing it to the array on the value kind enum. That took the better part of a day to figure out. I was almost to the point, and I hate this. This is terrible coding. But I was almost to the point of throwing in a try catch, trying to parse it as an array, and if it errored, then doing the stuff that I the else.
If you're forced to do it, it's not wrong.
Yeah, y'all can't see the look on Will's face. That was the look I was making when I was typing that code out, and it worked. And I'm like, all right. If I run out of time, because I had to get it to them so that they could do their part, I was like, if I run out of time, at least I got this, and I can come back and deal with it when I have more time.
I think the acceptable way to deal with that is to find some ASCII art of a burning dumpster. Say they made me do it. It's not my fault, and put that in there.
Yeah.
I actually found a piece of our code a little while back that's like, I don't like somebody wrote, I don't like the way we had to do this. I bet you $10 you can't do it better. And just left that in the code base.
It sounds like something I would do.
Because they were just frustrated beyond all hope. And they're just like, you know what? If somebody fixes it, I'll pay them $10.
Yeah.
So it works. It works.
Yeah. That was a pain. Don't even get me started on the issue with the ternary statements within a switch case. Will got an eyeful because it was text. So I don't know. Earful doesn't seem right with the Hangouts messages, but yeah, he got to hear all about that. Yeah. So that was my work week since our last recording session. Yesterday, got Amanda moved into her new place. It was supposed to be over the weekend, but we had some really nasty weather, so it got postponed. Like Friday, it was decent out, and so her parents and I helped her get most of the smaller stuff, like the small furniture, that kind of stuff over there, with the idea that we were going to rent a trailer and do the bigger stuff on Saturday. And then it was just horrible weather all day long, so we postponed. Got it done. Didn't take much. She only had about three or four big things like her bed or couch, that kind of stuff to take in the trailer. So two of us did that in a couple of hours, but that was that was fun. I am still tired from that. Fun news, we're getting ready for Easter at church. Will talked about it Friday being Good Friday, so we got a short week. We're going to have a special Easter medley in the service, so I'm going in Friday night for the practice for that, so I can be on a camera and determine, hey, what shots do we want to get? How do we want to do this? That kind of stuff. So it'll be a lot of fun. So guys, if you haven't done so already, check out the free or public aftercast from our April 1st episode on being unoffendable. Since we started doing the aftercast, this is our very first April 1st special episode, and we decided to make that publicly available over on Patreon. Check it out. If you like what you hear, sign up on Patreon to get access to all of our aftercasts.
You'll often hear about developers, including both of us, who regularly use pair programming. The practice of pair programming can be very helpful for sharing knowledge across the team, working through a difficult chunk of code, or simply showing how your team approaches their daily workflow, especially when working with a new hire. Pair programming also helps team members get to know each other and each other's thought processes, which is very important in our current COVID age where people are working remotely.
Yeah, it can be hard to convince management and other developers to allow pair programming. Your typical corporate bean counter, Willisms there, will see the practice as simply doubling the cost of the same piece of work. Project managers will often view the practice as something that jeopardizes project timelines for dubious benefits. Other developers might balk at the idea as well, both because they are self-conscious about the way they write code and because they may find it boring. On that, to almost everyone involved, it sounds like yet another meeting that will chew up part of the day. And as we all know, almost all meetings stink and most people don't like them.
In this episode, we'll discuss pair programming, when and why you might want to do it, as well as when you might not want to use it. Then we'll discuss what to do while you're in a pair session. We'll finish by discussing how to sell the idea to people in various roles on your team.
Guys, saving money can be hard, whether you are a corporate bean counter or you are just a developer working hard to make a living.
Lucas Casades is a fee-only certified financial planner. He owns and runs Level Up Financial Planning virtually out of Fort Collins, Colorado.
Yeah, just like us, he focuses on helping you not only establish a real plan, but also take action to live your best life. Now, guys, investing in a financial planning service really comes down to whether or not you can improve your finances with the help of Level Up. The compounding impact of making better financial decisions will easily pay for itself.
Best of all, Level Up has a unique pricing model that will help you no matter where you are in your financial journey. So it's not too early to get started, and you don't have to be a bean counter to get by.
Exactly. Guys, you can find some fun, free resources and learn more about Level Up Financial Planning at levelupfinancialplanning.com. So we've broken the episode down into kind of 3 sections. The first one we're going to talk about is the basics of pair programming. And to understand the basics, we have to start off with what it is and why you want to do it.
Yeah, so it sounds kind of obvious, but pair programming requires 2 programmers. If more, it's actually called a mob. And I've done this once or twice, with I think as many as 12 people in the room, like putting it up on a projector and going through something.
Not done that. I've done it with 3 or 4. Usually it was like 2 API and 2 UI.
Yeah, this was, I forget what exactly it was. It was something that was fairly critical. And I know it was kind of like it was a test thing for some standards.
Mm.
And so we're going to do this, and these are going to be the new system standards, and we can kind of do that in real code.
Yeah.
And it's been years, but that's an interesting approach to doing that. I hope to never go through that again because, when you got that many people deciding standards, nothing actually gets decided by those people. It's decided by somebody else once they get frustrated enough with all the time it gets burned, but whatever. But basically the idea here is you have 2 programmers, and they typically will use a single computer. At least in the pre-COVID days, they would, sit at the same desk and use a single computer. It's not quite like that now because, COVID, we're not in the same place anymore.
Though they can get a very similar effect with a lot of tools that are out there.
Yeah. We emulate it now, which is actually somewhat better because it gives you a few other opportunities while you're doing this. So one developer will, do the work while discussing what they're doing with the other. The second developer might also have a computer or other device and use it to take notes, look up things for the first developer, review specifications, get a hold of management and go, hey, this isn't clear. We're going to be dealing with this here in a minute. Basically the second person can sit there and remove roadblocks for the first one.
Yeah. The idea here is that by having the 2 developers working on a single piece of code, you avoid creating knowledge silos. You also improve the quality of the code you're writing because you have more than one set of eyes looking at it, and increase team cohesion by having people actually working together. It's quite interesting. Even before COVID, we were doing this using Visual Studio Live Share and Teams meetings. So one of us would share our screen. We could follow along with the other person, but we'd also share the screen so we could show what we were looking at too. It was quite interesting because I was working with our lead UI developer, and he was like getting me up to speed on the newer Angular stuff by having me code it and him like talking me through it. And he was learning the .NET by him working and me talking him through it.
Yeah. And does Teams work well with, was it Live Share or whatever the Visual Studio pairing deal is? Like, does it hook into Teams?
No, it doesn't. We just shared the screen.
Okay. I was wondering if I've been doing it wrong. That's why it's like, because I do that at least once a day.
Yeah. No, the live share is really nice. But yeah, no, it doesn't.
You always look for new stuff. Yeah. I'm going to go look after we get done recording because that never occurred to me.
Yeah.
Team cohesion from pair programming is often an undervalued result of this process, but it's really important when dealing with remote and distributed teams. I don't know if, I imagine a lot of our listeners now understand this problem a bit better than they might have, say, a year and a month ago. Because you have new employees coming in, they're remote, they never really click with the team, and then they turn over and everybody's like, what did they do again? And that kind of loss of team cohesion is actually pretty destructive. Like it's also knowledge loss if that person's been there a while. So you really, really want to protect that. And pair programming is one good way to do that, without it being like some kind of corporate, trust fall workshop type deal. It's like you're actually producing value.
Even in organizations where pair programming isn't common, it does often happen, like Will was saying, with onboarding a new team member. There's a lot of that just to get them up to speed on things. The larger practice of pair programming can be viewed as a long-term extension of this onboarding practice.
Yeah, because you're just always onboarding.
Yeah.
And trying to get people more and more adapted to the company
mm-hmm.
so that when you move, you all move as one. Speaking of moving along, figuring out when to pair program is probably one of the most important things. You don't want to do this 100% of the time, or at least you probably aren't going to want to do this. There's probably some companies that try to force it and, get brownie points on Hacker News or whatever, but it's kind of terrible because it's exhausting. Instead, you should be more strategic. So what?
So to an introvert, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I could even see extroverts after 3 or 4 hours of it because it's it's a meeting. It's an artificial, constrained type thing.
It doesn't allow you to problem solve. It doesn't allow you to do what works best for you.
Right.
To problem solve, because you're always having to do it the team way, even if it's just a team of 2.
Yeah. So you do have to be strategic about when you do it. Ideally, you'll only pair program when it actually provides value. So you won't do it just on random crap that comes up. It's stuff that, 2 people actually makes the process better.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I mentioned before about the pair programming sessions I've been doing with our lead UI developer. One of the big things about pair programming and when it works best is when you're showing another developer something they haven't seen before. So it may be a particularly nasty piece of code that you've written. It may be like our scenario where, I know Angular JS, but I haven't done much past that. And so he's showing me the newer stuff, and
it's way better, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And he hasn't done pretty much any .NET other than just looking at it and consuming .NET APIs. And so he's learning that from me. And so it's a nice back and forth. It's been kind of fun to build this little project. Sort of a side thing. We actually count it as training, and we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about selling the idea.
Yeah, it also works really well when you really do need 2 people's expertise. So it's not so much training as in people are in 2 different silos.
Mm-hmm.
This happens a lot when you port an old system or get the data out of an old system into a new system. You'll have to have both parties on there because you're like, what is this field? I don't know if you've dealt with like really old SQL databases where there was a set of principles with the way people designed things like 20 something years ago where they kept things like field names short, and it was like super abbreviated.
You know where I work, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
that was kind of a facetious comment, really, now that I think about it.
There are people I work with who, have continued doing that for the last 20 years.
Yeah. And when you deal with those, you're like, what in the world is this field? And, there may not be any documents. The documents may be wrong. They may not be accessible.
Mm-hmm.
Or it may be some field that's like, well, invoice number. Well, it's invoice number unless it's a refund and then it's some other identifier, for instance. And there's like a secondary rule that you don't know anything about.
Yeah.
And so you get those 2 people together and pair on something when you're moving data over, and you'll probably avoid a lot of the problems that can happen.
Yeah. When I started my first job, the upper management they had some people who they had asked, previously had asked them to rewrite a system in like the more modern style, and they just basically copied it over.
Yeah.
They told us, you're replacing this system, but we're not giving you access to it. We're not allowing you to look at what it does. You have to like we're forcing Scrum. You have to go talk to the business people and things like that. The problem was it was a system that had been around for a long time, and the people the business gave us to talk to didn't know all the intricacies and ins and outs. They just knew what they worked with and what the people around them like worked with, not the whole aspect. And so like we built what they asked for, exactly what they asked for, and they couldn't use it.
Yep.
So yeah, that happens.
Yeah. Happens a lot with older orgs too.
Yeah. That's what happens when you're not allowed to, when you don't do this kind of pair programming.
Yeah, and sometimes you can't because things like the licenses are ridiculously expensive, or it's a machine that's got sensitive data because stuff isn't partitioned well. They want you to test against production because you're just pulling data.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, but they don't want to give you real access to see what the guts are. So yeah, been there, done that. It's also really good for onboarding new developers, getting them used to your company's processes. You start out, everybody's like, oh, well, there's a great workflow, and everybody, we're doing industry standard. There is no industry standard, dude. That's not like people say that. There's not a thing. Some people have continuous deployment. Some people have a batch file that they run once every 6 months and then manually tweak a bunch of loose files and FTP it somewhere.
Yep.
And every company has got little corners of the business that have those kind of things still going on. Because really like ghetto shell scripts, processes that are implemented in Excel files, just that stuff is still around. And so when you onboard a new person, either you have to show them your mess, or you have to make sure that they know that there isn't a mess because they came from one.
Yeah.
And so you're going to have to use it to onboard.
Finally, pair programming is very effective when you need another developer's help to get unstuck.
Yeah. I had this fairly recently. We're implementing a query builder pattern over the top of Entity Framework. And we're doing that because we initially had repositories. And over time, basically what happens is your repository methods start including more and more data because they get reused. And somebody's like, oh, I can reuse this and just add this other pile of crap to it that it needs to pull back for this one thing, but there's 20 other places that call it. And so you start putting more and more load on the system doing that. And so we're kind of reworking to a query builder pattern, which sounds great until you need to mock it for unit tests.
Mm.
And you have like this fluent interface that has to be called in a certain order for X unit to play nice. Otherwise you don't get a result, or it's like it's not implemented. And yeah, so I had to get my team lead in and go, hey, we've got to find a better way to do this because, like you write the code, you're done with the code in 30 minutes. And then you spend the next 6 hours writing unit tests because it's try it. Okay, it blew up. Here's where it blew up. Let me fix that. Oh, it blew up this other way. Oh, I need to fix my code under test slightly. Now I've completely eradicated my tests working, and I have to go back and refiddle with it. And so it's just a nightmare. And getting another pair of eyes on there going, hey, I've seen some stuff in X unit that you can do, or not X unit, in mock, to mock this differently. And
I like
restructuring things. Yeah, it's great, but against a query builder type pattern, or really a fluent interface just in general, you have to really think about how you structure stuff, and you have to structure your test differently so that you mock it in a way that you don't break it next time you introduce a new test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I've faced those issues.
Yeah.
Even with a repository pattern, I've faced some of those issues. I'll be honest with you though, dude. When I saw in here, he has a note, Will's story about mocking and getting help from a team lead, I literally thought that he was making fun of the team lead to get his help. Well, because that would be Will's style of getting help from someone.
That is what I did. But and Zach's a listener, so he'll hear this here in another few months. I think he's like 70 or 80 episodes behind us now, so he'll catch up and he'll hear this and he'll laugh. But
yeah, hello, Will's team lead. How are you?
Yeah.
All right, guys. So now that we've talked about when you want to pair program, we're going to kind of quickly go through when not to pair program.
It's really difficult to pair program when the two developers involved don't get along. They have a major language barrier or they don't use similar technologies to do their job unless one of them is trying to learn the technology used by the other. Right. So for instance, if you got a guy that's a old school Win32, desktop app developer and you're doing Angular stuff and they kind of have contempt for the web, which I've encountered, you can't pair program with this person because they're not going to learn anything and they're just going to be looking down their nose at the way you do stuff. And I've seen it go the other way too.
Yeah. Another time that you don't want to pair program is when you don't have a clean way to share a screen and to give control to the other party. Some security setups make this difficult, especially when you're remote. I know we mentioned Visual Studio Live Share, which is great because you're not giving them, this is the thing I love about it, you're not giving them, remote access to your computer. They have an instance of your code that relates to you, but it's only like through Visual Studio. So they can't access anything else on your machine. So nice. I really, really like that.
Yeah, my favorite is when you are having to use a VPN to connect so that you can RDP into your machine. The other person is using a VPN to connect to RDP into their machine. And basically things are set up so that they can't hit your RDP'd instance from theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't screen share. Like there's some weird setups that you can get into where it's like, yeah, I can't show you the code. I can copy and paste it somewhere. That's the best I can do. It's pretty terrible, but it is a thing that used to happen a lot more. I imagine the companies that had that kind of setup now are really, really hurting from it, and they'll eventually go away because it's dumb. Now, when either party is completely overloaded with a totally different task, where the pair programming would be a burden, that's also not a good time to pair. When people have a whole lot of pressure on them, pair programming is unlikely to be a positive experience because of the stress level.
Oh, yeah. And I will say this is one of the things I really appreciate about the lead developer I'm working with. Will knows him personally too. And like, it's a great setup because if it's either one of us has something they have to do, like we have a regularly scheduled, like honestly, it's Tuesday afternoons. And we've just agreed, hey, the Tuesday before a product review, we're not going to pair. And then there'll be other times where we're just like, hey, it might be an hour before that one of us reaches out to the other and be like, hey, I am slammed. Can we skip this week? And that happens,
Yeah, it's perfectly normal. Also, don't pair program when your session is likely to be interrupted at random intervals. You really need a long period of focus time in order to pair program. So, like if you're at home, you're working remote, and you are the sole caregiver for a small child, you're probably not going to be able to pair program effectively.
Yeah.
Because that's what they do. They interrupt at random. Or if you're having construction done on your house, that's another good example. Or you're waiting for phone calls or whatever. Bear in mind that yes, if it's just 5 minutes away, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but it's actually an interruption for two people, in a situation where you're kind of already at a disadvantage as far as the bean counters,
mm-hmm.
The way that they look at it. So it's very expensive and it creates a lot of stress and you're not going to do well.
Yeah. Now that we've talked about the basics of pair programming, we're going to talk about sort of what to do while you are pair programming, talk about some issues you might run into and just understanding the process in general. So first off, I think the most important thing when you're doing this is who should be in control.
Yeah. Now, it is generally a cooperative effort, but somebody is driving the computer. And this tends to be a position that has a lot of control, although you do need to make sure the other party has input. It can also be a little bit difficult to decide who this person should be. Sometimes one person wants to do it and the other doesn't. And so theoretically, that's easy. Of course, sometimes it should be the person that doesn't want to do it that does it.
A lot of times it should.
Yeah.
Let's be honest. Though, if you look at my situation, it would be a lot easier and faster for me to do the .NET code and for him to do the Angular code. But that's not the purpose of the session.
Right.
The session is for the other person to grow and learn. We're helping each other out by not doing the thing that we're good at and instead sitting back and guiding. So yeah, that makes sense. Now, if both people want to control the pair programming session, then you should choose the person based on the goal of the session. Like I said, our goal was training, so that's how we picked that. See, sort of an obvious choice in that. Is the goal to get something done, to teach one person something? Your goal should drive the selection of the person who drives the computer. That's the key here.
Yeah.
And then if neither person wants to do it, you should spend some time examining why. It may not be a good time to pair. Like, we were just talking about, when not to pair. This might be one of those times not to pair. Or you may not have defined the purpose well enough. Like, you don't have a good goal, so go back and reassess your goal. And it may be that you just both need a break and possibly some coffee.
Yeah, those first thing in the morning pair programming sessions.
Yeah, that's why mine's in the afternoon.
Yeah, when those happen, invariably there is one party that really needs about 2 cups of coffee to be useful, at the beginning of the day, unless you're both morning people. And I don't have the impression that most of the population is, even though a large portion of the population lies and says that they are. It doesn't fit what I see. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. Well, they're morning people. They're just also addicted to coffee.
Yeah. Well, so am I, but I don't know. It's the fatigue thing first thing in the morning can be an issue. It can also be an issue right after lunch.
Yeah.
That's another time that really doesn't work well for pair programming. You also have to pay attention as far as the control and consider when you're going to switch places. One person should probably not be driving the whole time. There's cases where this is not a bad idea, but for the most part, I would say that you need to switch. Programming session is very long. One person being in control the entire time is going to make them tired and it's going to make the other person bored. So instead, you want to change hands. Usually when somebody gets tired or they start getting stuck, they start making mistakes or they can't think through things. It's because they've been looking at the screen too long and trying to essentially do coding as a performance art. So switch off and, take the pressure off of them. And you might also do it when the task is better suited to the other person.
Yeah. That's the thing. We do, I think, like an hour and a half sessions. Well, we have an hour and a half blocked off because let's be honest, the first 30 minutes we're just catching up because we're friends. And like, since I moved in COVID, we haven't seen each other. So like, it's more of like just a 30-minute hangout session followed by like an hour of really intense coding training. And so it builds team cohesion and it's good. But we usually don't switch because we're typically attacking one task, either a UI task or an API task. And what's fun is we went and because we're playing around with like Azure DevOps and stuff, and we went and like created tasks and like stories and everything for these. And so we'll tackle not one task, usually one story, and knock out all the tasks under that. So it'd be like a UI story or an API story, and we'll switch between sessions. So it'd like 1 week I'll be doing a bunch of UI, the next week he'll be doing a bunch of API.
Yeah.
So
that's pretty workable. What I do with my team lead, a lot of times he ends up driving.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is I have a large screen.
Yeah.
And sharing is very, very weird on Teams if you're not sharing a full screen, because it's like, okay, I've got to switch between windows every time I switch a window, which doesn't sound like a big thing until you realize that apparently the target window handle changes when Visual Studio runs. And so it's like, okay, I typed in the code, let's run it and, see, like look at the build output or whatever. And yeah, he can't see it anymore, or breakpoints. And like I have to unshare, run the thing, share, and go back in. And you do that time after time and it gets old. Whereas he's just on one screen and it's a smaller screen. And so I can blow it up on mine and see it. We can work through everything. And so that's why we typically don't switch, is there's a technological issue there with Teams that I hope they fix, but they haven't yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, you mentioned it already. The person driving will eventually get tired. The thing about that is it happens a lot faster than you think it would, because it's a performance. You're like, I like to tell people, like, I use the term you're on, and like it, you know, my personality, like Will does. And you guys as listeners, you know it from listening.
Yeah, you're
to the
probably
show.
aware.
Yeah, of my personality. I turn off, like in the evenings. I am not as boisterous and as hyper and stuff. Like, it's who I am, but also I need to like wind myself down. And as an extrovert, I remember telling my sister, like, I'm peopled out. I need a break. And she's like, but you're an extrovert. You get energy from that. I'm like, yeah, you like going out in the sun. You live in Florida. You like going out in the sun. What happens if you spend too much time in the sun? You get burned. I'm getting burnt out. I need a little. I remember telling Amanda, I was like, I just need to shut down. I just need to turn off. We were on a road trip somewhere, and she was like, okay. And I did. And like, after we got to our next stop at the gas station, I got out and I was like, thanks for letting me do that. She's like, that was the freakiest thing ever.
What, you being quiet?
Yeah. But yeah, like, and so that's what I think of when you're talking about like getting tired, is like that presentation. I mean, you and I, we do 2 hours of it every Tuesday night, where we do an hour of the podcast and then basically an hour of the aftercast. And after that, I'm spent.
Yeah, there's nothing in the tank.
Yeah, because I mean, I could, if I had to, I could keep going, but I know I got to get up tomorrow and I've got a bunch of meetings tomorrow. So I'm like, as soon as I'm done with this, I'm going to go. And now this is a time when I do watch TV, because I can zone out and, just sort of whatever, not have to think about it. Yeah. Anyway, we're a bit off topic here. So sorry about that, man.
Yeah. I can't imagine us getting off topic.
Yeah. So switching places doesn't mean that you stop doing anything. Instead, it means that you should be doing things like looking up supporting documentation, using chat tools to talk to stakeholders, or taking notes along the way. You also should be helping the person who is actively doing the work and paying attention to what they're doing. I've literally been in pair programming sessions where I wasn't the one coding. And it was one of those things where we were both API developers and we were working through a tough problem. And the other guy was writing a for loop and messed up.
Yeah.
Because we had been so deep in like this, trying to figure out this difficult problem, that he was just trying to quickly write a for loop to test it. And messed up. I'm like, hey. And that's what your other person should be doing. They're kind of like watching over your shoulder to make sure you don't make mistakes, and to be there for that. But they're also going, like, sometimes you're coding and you're like, wait, what's this supposed to return? Is it supposed to return an array or just a string? And I have something else for the array. And you have to go look it up. Well, they can be looking that up for you.
And the other thing too, is it kind of takes the pressure off of it feeling like a performance, which makes you less tired less quickly.
Sure.
So you'll make the other person tired if you don't do anything.
Yeah.
It's weird how that works out too. The idea here is that one person's working while another is sanity checking what they're doing, keeping track of ancillary stuff, etc. That keeps the work moving, keeps both people informed on what is going on, and keeps productivity high enough that the pencil pushers / bean counters / killers of joy in accounting don't notice it as much, if that's a problem.
Yeah. So on these lines, the next thing we're going to talk about is taking breaks. If you're doing a longer pair programming session, like, multiple hours or a day-long session, it's better to schedule these before the session if possible, because this avoids the awkwardness of people having to ask for bathroom breaks and stuff like that. I don't have a problem just standing up.
Yeah, I'll just like straight up say I gotta go bio.
Yeah.
I've played enough video games. It's fine with me. I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, I have IBS, so I got used to saying I gotta step out for a moment, and nobody questions it. They're usually pretty good about like, all right, cool, especially in a longer, like day long session. I've done some of those right before a product release where we were just doing like, it's usually me and a UI developer, and we're just going through and we're doing a bunch of tweaks, a bunch of like, it's usually like about 2 or 3 weeks out, and it's all the little things that have accumulated that they want to, all right, can we fix this, can we do that, and just like get these polish stuff.
See, I've had some of those long ones where the breaks were not scheduled.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing about that is you try to negotiate with it. We'll take a break right after this piece is done.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember being on one and like having to pop my hip because it's causing, you've seen me do that, right? Like I do the dancer's pose, which, you know, when I had like the full beard was a lot more impressive to people because you don't look like you're going to be able to do that. And, you know, like having to actually get up and go, look, I've got pain in my left hip. I've got to pop this, you know, get this back like it's supposed to be right now. And it typically works better if the breaks are planned so that you don't have to have those kind of awkward type of conversations. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You know, and plus you do kind of need to get away from the screen after a while too. Like it's bad on your eyes and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
You should be doing that anyway. And it's, you know, as a team, you need to coordinate to keep that happening.
Yeah. Now, the other thing is both people in the session probably have other responsibilities. And so it is important to balance those requirements with the requirements of the session. Whatever you do, don't let the other stuff fall apart while you're pair programming. This is why when the lead developer I work with and I do it, we're very cognizant of, hey, we've got this hour and a half blocked out for doing this, and we're going to tackle like one story at a time that can fit in this. Now, sometimes we'll get into it and it'll be easier than we thought, or I'll have picked up enough that I'm like, I'm knocking it out. And he's like, all right, well, let's start the next one. And if we don't get finished, we'll finish it next time.
Yep.
There've been a few cases where neither one of us had anything. It was before this current project we're on started. Well, we were still in like the requirements gathering phase. So we had the whole afternoon. And sometimes we take 2 or 3 hours and just, you know, hammer stuff out. It was fun and learned a lot. But yeah, we definitely took some breaks during those days. And finally, don't be overly focused on productivity. While it is important, if you aren't used to pair programming, it's more important to avoid burning out or creating interpersonal problems than it is to be productive. Tempers tend to rise when people are stressed. So be aware of this. You know, there have been times, and I'm not going to joke, where one or the other of us have been really frustrated about something, and we spent a good portion of our pair programming session just talking about it. Yep. You know, sometimes you just need an understanding ear to listen to you vent, and sometimes you need someone that you trust to go, yeah, but I understand the frustration, but you were kind of in the wrong there too. You know, and it's good to have those conversations. And when you've got like the code to focus on, sometimes you can kind of have those conversations on the side while you're doing the coding, and it's not as intense, I guess.
Yeah, because you're distracted from the interpersonal thing that you're trying to solve by the code, and so you don't flare as much. I've noticed that as well. It can actually be pretty helpful. Finally, you need to know when you're done. The most important thing to learn when doing anything, besides knowing when to start, is knowing when to stop. While pair programming is useful, it really only works for kind of short bursts. Past that point, it gets really tiring and your ability to get things done falls off a cliff, frankly.
Yeah.
When the breaks stop being effective, for instance, if you're as tired after the break as you were before it, it's probably time to stop for the day. A lot of developers feel like they can code really long bursts alone. I have some doubts about that, but you know, sometimes it's right if you really enjoy the work you're doing and you don't have any roadblocks. But you'll find that a lot of introverted developers tire out a lot quicker when pairing, and they can't do that.
Hey, I have paired with another extroverted developer.
I bet that was horrible.
Well, you guys probably know him. He used to have a podcast associated with ours.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I don't know that he would call himself an extrovert, but he was an extrovert. Let's be honest. Like, I've seen him around people. But it was intense because, you know, you got two extroverts, and our trouble was staying on task because we're friends too. You know, once we got that down, we were doing a proof of concept for an Alexa skill to demo at one of our dev chats, and that was a lot of fun once we got our focus and stuff, because like it was new to both of us. We had been in the same class, or what are they called at conferences? Classes? I forget. It's
Session.
been so long. Session. Thank you. That's the word I couldn't think of. I really, dude, I'm just like, they're not classes, but we've been in the same one.
Honestly,
at Music City Tech.
What you just did right there is something that you'll have happen.
Yeah.
Pair programming session where it's like, I can't remember, what is that called?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're alone, you'll just blank for 15 minutes trying to figure out what it is. And the other guy will be like, it's a session, bro.
Yeah, I won't just blank. I'll do this thing called Google.
Yeah, well, it's fun when you can't come up with, how do I search for that? Because I don't really know what that's called.
Oh, well, yeah, I suppose. Anyway, so we'd both been in the same session, and so we had the same starting point, but we would take turns. One of us would code and the other one would go out and look stuff up while we were working on this, and that was fun. But yeah, even extroverts, I don't want to say we got tired of each other, but sometimes it's just like, all right, I might want to be around people. I just need to, like, just that one-on-one. Yeah, we were talking like tempers flare. It wasn't that we were getting mad at each other or anything like that. It was just like, all right, we're starting to get on each other's nerves, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you can always see it coming, like, you know, especially if you've worked with somebody for a while, like the body language that comes up. You know, like I worked with another developer, and you could see like his jaw muscles just slightly start tightening up when he was getting annoyed, and you better pick that one up. Because like he, you know, that was 1 on the scale, 10 was the next.
Yeah.
It's the other thing is, if you do have a major problem that comes up that you have to stop to address, you probably have to stop for the day.
Yeah.
If you have to step away for 2 or 3 hours, you're probably done for the day.
Mm-hmm.
You lose context, and you know, when this happens, it's also really rare in a corporate environment where one big problem comes up and you solve it, and there isn't like a swarm of little problems with it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, if you are doing remote pair programming and communication issues start coming up, that's another reason to stop. We've had that where one or the other of us have had internet getting slow and just like spotty. We had that a few weeks ago on the podcast, and we had to stop and re-record the aftercast a week later because of it.
Yeah.
So that happens. That happens. All right, guys. So our final section here is selling it to leadership. We're going to talk about management and then specifically project managers. So first off, how to sell this to management. If you don't have to ask, it's generally better that you don't. We're lucky our management is pro pair programming, but
so is ours.
We didn't have to ask because we were able to say, hey, this is training. We're making our developers, this is cross training. And so it's like we're making our developers better, and we both log it as training hours.
Yeah, I've worked in places where they did not value that.
Yeah, I believe that.
Because they considered developers disposable, essentially. And you had to sneak. You know, you had to go, oh, you know, can I get another pair of eyes on this, and not ask management, go, I'll just ask him for some help real quick. And they like to see that. They like to see the collaboration, but they don't like to be asked for the collaboration, because now they're approving it and it feels like they're on the hook for it.
Yeah. Oh, that's big. That's big.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to sell the idea long term, wait until you have a particularly painful problem, then suggest pairing on it. It's easier to justify in these kind of circumstances. And if you can prove it works there, you're more likely to be able to get approval for it in less dire situations in the future. I have the opposite experience with this, not for pair programming, but where management put us all in a conference room to solve a problem. And the reason the problem got solved is because a couple of us worked a lot of extra hours at home on it, and management didn't see that. So the next time an issue came up, like upper management was like, hey, should we reserve a conference room and get everybody together in it? And they were told, thankfully we had a good manager who was like, you know why it worked last time? Because these three guys all spent probably 6 or 7 hours a week on their own time at home working on it.
Yep.
And you want them to actually, this is before we were remote. He's like, you want them to actually get this done? Send them home. Give them a week off and tell them, like, not off, but a week at home working remote, and they'll knock this out.
Yeah. And I used a similar strategy in my book, actually, about convincing management to let you work remotely.
Yeah.
Catch them when it's under duress, or catch them when it's harder to argue against testing something.
Now, make sure that if you talk to management about this, that both parties are involved in the conversation and both have useful observations. If just one person talks, management is very likely to think that the other one is just sitting around watching and not really doing anything.
Yeah. Just be aware that people kind of have the idea. I don't know if you remember, if you watched Game of Thrones or not, but the guy Littlefinger, when he would see something, he's like, what is the worst reason somebody would do what they're doing? And then he would run with that. And it worked for him because everybody in that show was a jerk pretty much. And you'll deal with those kind of people in management too, where they're like, oh, well, this person's not saying anything. So obviously they just sat there like a lump.
Yeah.
So just be aware of that. Speaking of sitting there like a lump, project managers sometimes have a whole nother set of problems with this. They tend to be really reluctant to allow pair programming, especially when there is a certain amount of throughput that is already expected in a typical sprint. They will see pair programming as a direct threat to throughput, and it can be over the short term, to be honest.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about it is, yeah, you're taking up the time of another developer. Now, if you're smart about it, if the project manager is smart, they'll understand that it's like an 8-hour workday is not 8 hours of development. It's closer to 5 or 6
at most.
Like once you added, of like an intense day is. And so they'll understand that. And you can say, yeah, the pair stuff is going on in those hours that aren't considered effective programming.
Yeah.
You can play with the numbers there for them, and that does help. The thing is, just like with your regular managers, assuming they aren't the same person, which does happen sometimes, the workflow is probably best executed by working together and then making the project manager aware of what you learned and the upsides you saw. So like the idea here is to tell them, like, here's what we're gaining out of it. Here's the business value of doing this. And that's a big thing.
Yeah. And don't ask permission, ask forgiveness if you have to. Again, if this person's not in your chain of command, you do have some leverage here that you should be using, because a lot of them don't know how to code, and you need to be aware of that. There is a bit of a uncomfortable dynamic here, especially if the project manager reports to the same manager that you do and productivity happens to drop, because they're going to focus on the pair programming session, even if something else was the problem.
Yeah. I mean, they're going to look at the thing that's different, or that they consider as wasting time. Even though it's not, they might consider it that way. Then if you're like a lot of teams, your productivity bottleneck is not going to be development. Pair programming may actually ease pressure on the bottleneck by lowering your current work in progress count, which means the stuff downstream from you can perform more effectively. Like you may see that work in progress decrease is not reflected at all in a throughput decrease downstream because you're basically taking some of the pressure off. Usually where I've seen it, it's been QA.
Yep.
It's like development gets a bunch of stuff done and then QA is the bottleneck because they have to test every little thing that development did, not just the happy path, but all the other paths that they can think of. And so by reducing the pressure on top of them, you might actually get them working faster and better because they're not feeling as much pressure and get like an increase down the line.
Pair programming is a useful way to improve code quality, cross-train team members, and onboard new developers quickly without boring training. In addition to making it easier to solve more difficult problems, it also helps with team cohesion and helps people understand how other team members think. Best of all, if done properly, it may not negatively impact your team's throughput. It could even improve it. And that pretty much wraps us up. Beej, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
So at the beginning of the episode, I talked about the issue we had with our UI and our API stories being a little bit different and the expectations differing. You know, the requirements were there for the UI, but not the API. And I just want to say, guys, when you're working on a team or even just with one other person, such as pair programming, communication is key to everything being successful. This means that you need to have the ability to listen to the other person. And sometimes like we get really attached to our code. It's like, you know, that's an extension of me. We need to be able to pull away from that, set our feelings aside to resolve any issues that they may have. For example, your code may be working absolutely perfectly. You know, you've tested every possible thing. It is absolutely working exactly the way you designed it, exactly the way it's supposed to be. But it's not functional because of how it interacts with theirs or how they need to consume it if you're an API developer. The thing about this is it also means being open to a dialogue about the situation. Instead of saying, this is what the code does with finality, you could say, this is what the code does now. What do you need from it? What do you need it to do? To open up that discussion and determine what all needs to be adjusted. Now, mind you, if you get a message at 10:30 on a Friday night and it's for new development, you can just say, hey, this is what it does. We can discuss it Monday, which is what I had to do the other day. Sometimes it will be your code that needs to be adjusted. Other times it will be their expectations that need to be adjusted. And guys, that's pretty much all I've got. Check out the aftercast. There are several points that Will had in here that we did not get to because we didn't have time. And so I think it's going to be a really good one talking about who you pair with. And bringing other people in and the other developers involved in selling the idea to them. So it's going to be a great show. Check it out.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@completedeveloperpodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons.
For references, show notes, and extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at completedeveloperpodcast.com. Help us make the show possible by supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/completedeveloperpodcast. You'll get extras, including a weekly aftercast where we discuss the topic of the week and bonus material with some of our patrons.
You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod, like our page on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram to keep up with news about the show. Join the conversation anytime via Slack by signing up at slack.completedevelopernetwork.com. Thanks for listening. See you next time.